How are we baselining what good looks like? And then what is the art of the possible for us to get there? That's really the question that comes up. Cyber resilience readiness, like what are the gaps?
Welcome to the CISO Signal. I'm Jeremy Ladner. If you enjoy true cybercrime investigations like this, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us grow the show and reach other cybersecurity leaders just like you. Now, picture this. A continent-sized vault of identity humming along in the darkness. Billions of records, decades of credit histories, the financial DNA of nearly every working adult in America. And then, one sunny summer day, a single unremarkable web portal inside that empire is unlocked. The victim was Equifax, and what slipped through that door, well, it touched the lives of almost 150 million people. For weeks, an invisible hand moved through their systems. Quiet, patient, and deliberate. No ransom note, no flashing alerts, just a silent siphoning, drawing identity data into shadows. Investigators would eventually conclude this wasn't a lone hacker or a crime of opportunity. It was the work of a foreign national state adversary, a threat actor with motives bigger than money, possessing patience measured in months. And when the breach finally came to light, the fallout inside Equifax was catastrophic. Careers ended overnight, leaders resigned under pressure, and yes, one executive ultimately served time in prison. It remains one of the most consequential breaches in modern history, not because of how it happened, but because of what it revealed about trust, leadership, and the fragility of the systems we all depend on. Today, we're joined by someone uniquely qualified to help us navigate the layers beneath this incident. Kavitha Mariappan, Chief Transformation Officer at this episode's sponsor, Rubrik. Kavitha is a seasoned cybersecurity and technology executive. She spent more than 2 decades shaping transformation at companies like Zscaler, Databricks, Cisco, and now Rubrik, where she leads CXO engagement across the Global 2000 and helps enterprises rethink resilience in the age of modern cyber risk. And we're welcoming back to the CISO Signal, Mark Dorsi. Mark is the CISO at Netlify, bringing his cloud-scale experience and practical perspective to help us unpack what really happened inside Equifax. Kavitha, Mark, welcome to the CISO Signal.
Jeremy, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I love this. Thanks so much for having me again.
Absolutely. Great to have you both with us. Now, let's begin the investigation. We are in the midst of a ceaseless war. Not of bombs or bullets, but of breaches, firewalls, and silent incursions. The targets? Our borders, our banks, our commerce, and the critical infrastructure that underpins a free civilization. The enemy is cloaked in code, fueled by greed, glory, and a desire for chaos. This is the story of the unseen protectors, the nameless generals, the CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers. They are the guardians at the gate, the watchers on the wall, ever vigilant and always listening for the CISO Signal. Act 1, The Forgotten Portal. Kavitha, you work with some of the biggest companies in the world, and you've seen this pattern over and over. A vulnerability is known, the patch exists, but somehow it still slips through the cracks. When you look at Equifax through that real-world lens, what does a miss like that tell you about the challenges enterprises face at scale?
You know, Jeremy, I think with this specific incident, the vulnerability itself, it wasn't that unusual. What stood out was how easily, it slipped between the teams once awareness didn't translate into action. Most large organizations were aware of the Apache Struts issue, right? The patch did exist. Regardless, awareness wasn't the failure, it was around execution. We think about this at enterprise scale, how patching competes with uptime.
In early 2017, nothing about Equifax suggested danger. The lights stayed on late in Atlanta. Data centers breathed evenly, air-conditioned aisles, blinking status LEDs, the steady rhythm of machines doing what they had always done. Credit files moved invisibly across networks. Scores updated overnight. Mortgages cleared, background checks passed, millions of lives advanced, one quiet transaction at a time. Equifax did not sell products to consumers in the way banks or retailers do. It sold certainty, or at least the appearance of it. A numerical judgment about who could be trusted, distilled from addresses, birth dates, payment histories, and one unchangeable identifier, a social security number. For most Americans, this data was not optional. It was collected by default, stored indefinitely, and guarded, at least in theory, by professionals.
You deal with legacy systems, you deal with deadlines and a lot of invisible handoffs. And so these teams, assume someone else owns it. I think this is the problem today, right? It's everyone's responsibility and no one is accountable for it. As we start talking about resilience more and more, I think so much onus and pressure on CISOs and on the security teams, but and yet, are they empowered to own organizational resilience, right? And I think this is where responsibility or accountability diffuses, risk hides. This complexity doesn't just slow things down, it creates massive vulnerabilities and security gaps, organizational gaps, enterprise gaps that actually obscure accountability. And it's not that organizations don't follow process and that they don't patch or they don't care or they don't have the rigor. There's a lot of it. There's a lot of legacy technology in our environment, legacy processes, organizational structure, but clear lines of ownership start to become very important.
Inside the company, the work felt routine. Security notices arrived, patches were discussed, risk registers updated. No alarms rang, no screens flashed red. The system was calm. But calm in large organizations can be very deceptive. In March of 2017, the Apache Software Foundation issued a public advisory. A critical vulnerability had been discovered in Apache Struts, a widely used open source web framework. The flaw, later cataloged as CVE-2017-5638, allowed remote code execution. In plain terms, if a system was exposed and unpatched, an attacker could send a specially crafted request and gain control. The advisory was not obscure, it was not whispered, it was posted publicly. A patch was available immediately, and across the internet, most security teams took note.
It's not a technology problem, patching in itself. It is a governance and accountability problem. It's an organizational problem. This specific incident, that's really a painful reminder of what happens when gaps go unchallenged.
Inside Equifax, according to later congressional testimony and internal reviews, the alert was circulated. Teams were notified. Instructions were issued to identify and remediate vulnerable systems. On paper, the process worked the way it always did. But in reality, it depended on something far more fragile: ownership, knowing exactly who is responsible for what. Large enterprises grow by acquisition, integration, and urgency. Systems are spun up to meet deadlines. Temporary solutions often become permanent. Asset inventories drift out of date, and responsibility fragments. One team makes the incredibly dangerous assumption that the other team, well, they have it covered.
Mark, when you see an 11-week dwell time, like what happened at Equifax, what does that say to you about the challenges big organizations face when older systems meet modern identity problems?
These types of dwell times are not uncommon, unfortunately, and we see them all the time in the industry. And so the dwell times can be very long, depending on what an individual is trying to get done, and or they might just sit on it. Then all of a sudden they need some cash, they sell it, and another threat actor rolls through and actually makes the exploit occur. So what I see from an organization perspective is that we have long tried a variety of methods, from SIMs to all that other sort of stuff, and we've tried a lot of different areas in order to try and get that to happen. And there are different approaches. You can combine these things, you can put them together.
Somewhere inside Equifax's vast infrastructure sat a consumer dispute web portal that relied on Apache Struts. It was internet-facing, it handled sensitive data, and it did not receive the patch. No one marked the moment. There was no failure log that read, "This is where it all went wrong." The vulnerability existed quietly, like a cracked seal in a pressurized system, holding until it didn't. From the outside, Equifax still looked solid, a cornerstone institution, a necessary one. Few consumers could even describe how it worked, only that it did. That trust was structural, not earned day by day, but assumed by design. And that was the danger.
And as the CISO of the organization, you are attempting to balance risk. Most CISOs struggle not because they don't want to do the right thing in these areas. It's mostly because as they're trying to defend the castle, there are lots of folks who are attacking at all times. The questions are which ones would have access and which ones can find their way through your defenses at speed.
Security at scale is less about dramatic attacks than about mundane follow-through. It lives or dies in inventories, ownership, charts, and the unglamorous discipline of patch management. When those processes fail, nothing happens at first. Systems continue to run, businesses continue as usual, which is why the most important moment in this story passed without notice. No attacker had yet been detected, no data had yet been stolen, at least not that anyone could prove. But the conditions were set. The door was left unlocked. The lights were still on, and the organization, confident in its routines, went on with its day-to-day. What the company cannot yet see is already obvious to anyone paying attention. In modern cybercrime, the breach rarely begins with intrusion. It begins with neglect. Somewhere beyond the firewall, someone would eventually notice that the door was unlocked, and when they did, they would just let themselves in. Act 2. The Silent Siphon. By mid-2017, the door that had been left unlocked was finally opened. There was no overt break-in or loud failure. According to Equifax's later reconstruction of events, the attackers sent a single, carefully crafted request to the consumer dispute web portal, one that took advantage of the unpatched Apache Struts vulnerability, disclosed months earlier. The response they received wasn't an error message. It was access.
Rubrik's Zero Labs research shows that identity activity often gives the first real clues that a breach is unfolding. When you apply that to Equifax, how should companies think about identity behavior as an early warning?
Jeremy, we just heard Mark talk about dwell time, right? I think one of the things we're seeing is like threat actors are not breaking in, they're logging in. And their environments for 6 months, a year, doing their recon. And whether it's that specific threat actor or another group of threat actors are actually going to perpetrate, they're in the environment. And I would say, identity compromise is one of the most reliable ways of achieving dwell time, like what we saw with this specific Equifax breach. And the significance of the statistic that, at least from CrowdStrike, for example, is that 79% of incidents that they've investigated over the past year were malware-free. Threat actors today are prioritizing credential theft over malware because it's less noisy.
From the outside, the request looked like routine traffic. From the inside, it executed commands on the server itself. Remote code execution is a blunt phrase for something disturbingly intimate. The ability to tell another organization's machines what to do and have them obey. What followed did not unfold fast. It was painfully patient.
And unless some exploit is completely novel, today's security tools have a pretty good chance at catching them. And I think we're going to see a lot more happen, a lot more telemetry and signals as we start using AI. And that becomes kind of a whole new domain in terms of like what signals do we act upon when a threat actor logs on with legitimate credentials. The indicators of compromise are more subtle, right? They may start with someone authenticating in ways that don't quite align with normal behavior. We see this as anomalous with someone's behavior at odd hours, from odd locations, unfamiliar paths, privileges they don't have access to. And we always think about the ultimate act, which is, has data been exfiltrated? We should be thinking about what is anomalous from a behavior perspective, right from the endpoint all the way through.
Once inside the portal, the attackers began to explore file paths, permissions, connections to back-end systems. According to subsequent investigations, they escalated privileges and moved laterally through the network, stepping carefully, testing boundaries, learning where valuable data lived and how it flowed. There were no alert messages, no systems went dark.
These sorts of behavior anomalies are often tip-offs. And Mark touched a little bit upon the character of some of this. And this is what comes when someone's trusted identity is compromised. And we haven't even touched upon non-human identities or agentic identities and how we're going to handle all of that. But the signals are usually there. Questions going to be about the sophistication and the resourcing around interpretation, organizational culture.
Customers continued submitting disputes, employees continued their shifts, and the machinery of credit reporting never paused. Behind the scenes, however, the attackers reached databases that should never have been reachable from a public-facing application. There, stored in plain relational tables, were the building blocks of identity itself. Names, social security numbers, dates of birth, addresses, driver's license numbers, and in some cases, credit card data. This was not data that ever expired. It did not rotate. It did not change with a password reset. Once copied, it was useful, relevant, and dangerous forever.
And we're seeing organizations collect vast, enormous amount of data, enormous amount of identity data. Identity space itself is becoming like this robust ecosystem unto itself. It's like top 3 for all CISOs. I see Mark smiling. Everyone's talking about that. Everyone's talking about segmentation. But often it's, we talk about authorization telemetry rather than truly authenticating a user from a context perspective, right? From a behavioral perspective and all of this, which is why we see kind of this explosion around the posture management space, etc. So why identity has effectively become the new perimeter is this. It's easy. It's easier, so much easier to compromise identities, so much easier to compromise. And I think the hybrid workplace has also created this environment of, are people patching enough? Are people getting upgrades? Are these user awareness trainings really sticking, right? And without the ability to secure these identities or to establish the veracity thereof and recover it once it's compromised, the game is up. So I think that's really where we are.
One of Equifax's network monitoring tools, the system responsible for inspecting encrypted outbound traffic, was effectively blind. According to Equifax's own disclosures to Congress, the device relied on an SSL certificate that had expired. Without a valid certificate, the system could not decrypt or inspect the traffic passing through it.
Kavitha, when people bring up Equifax, there's always this kind of lingering sense of unease. What do you think causes that? Is it the sheer number of data stolen, the silence while it happened, or the bigger implications behind it?
Personally, I think it unsettles people because it was quiet. And for an attack of that scale, right? It was present, it's persistent. Nothing exploded. There was no ransom note. And then for weeks, the system looked stable, but the stability and invisibility of that can look pretty identical from outside, right? And so I think that creates a false sense of security, which is kind of what, both of us have been saying sort of in this conversation about how long has someone been in your environment?
The attackers did not need to disable detection because detection was already disabled. Alerts that might have raised questions never fired. Logs that could have told a story stayed silent. And the breach progressed not because defenses were overwhelmed, but because they were looking the other way. From the attacker's perspective, this was ideal. There was no need for ransomware theatrics, no reason to announce themselves. This was not a smash for cash. It was acquisition, quiet, systematic, and disciplined.
It wasn't an alert that surfaced a breach. It was someone paying closer attention than usual. And this is all about signals and remediation. And then I think I always worry about how much the explosion of AI and AI SIMs, et cetera, are going to create an environment where we have signal fatigue. So it underpins everything: credit, trust, safety, daily life, right? And that silence stops being limited to an IT issue or a security issue. This is an organizational issue. This is people trust us, to hold their very confidential credentials. What's our duty of care around that? And that's a huge part of it.
Yeah, I think that falls right in line with, silence being a very dangerous symptom. Like you mentioned, this wasn't discovered because of the amount of noise that was created. Someone was really curious. about what was going on in a particular area in their environment. And the size and scope of the breach, right, just make it so unforgettable, and why folks harken back to it with relative ease, right? There's also, a few from Target and those sorts of things that sit out there that sort of linger in our minds. So not too long ago, I was contacted to pay the remainder of a hospital visit. And they wanted me to verify myself versus them being able to verify themselves. And when you talk about identity, right, they call me and they say, can you please verify who you are? And I said, well, I don't know who you are. You first. You contacted me. I did not contact you. And so so the systems are also just not set up for success, especially when it comes to trying to identify someone.
Outside the walls of Equifax, life went on. Credit approvals, apartment leases, job offers, every transaction, assuming the integrity of data that was, at that very moment, being siphoned away. On July 29, 2017, something finally shifted. Security personnel noticed suspicious outbound traffic connections that did not fit expected patterns. The portal was then taken offline. An internal investigation began, and of course the company's tone forced to change from routine to controlled urgency. But by then, the damage was already done. The data had been copied, and whatever questions investigators would later ask, like who did this, how much was taken, and where did it all go, none of those questions could reverse the act itself, because data, once exfiltrated, does not come back.
So Mark, you have led teams through acquisitions and high-pressure investigations where leadership wants answers fast. In the first few hours of a major breach like the one with Equifax, before anyone knows the full scope, what does that moment feel like? How do you drive clarity when there is just so much uncertainty?
This is that moment where you try and get folks out of feeling mode, and you need to get into just the facts. What's going on from a facts perspective? And it's definitely this fog of uncertainty, but decisions really can't wait in that moment. And what you're going to try and really do is focus on, that containment, right? So we're going to come through and say, all right, what areas do we think of the business are impacted? And how do we contain what's going on? And then, just the moment where you have sometimes a conflation of folks who were directly responsible for the overall security of the environment. And then they're now going to have to go figure out what went wrong. And that's that moment where for a long period of time, you needed to have really had this culture built in, not of blame. We need to have a culture where folks can go through and feel safe to say, yeah, they came through this. Kind of knew it was a problem, or we didn't know it was a problem at all. And then now we understand why. And then we can take a look in other parts of the business. This happens a lot, I would say, in day in, day out around fraud and abuse. And in those ways, you're really trying to find your way through to say, look, I need everyone to calm down just a little bit.
Inside Equifax, decision-making moved quickly out of technical teams and into executive, legal, and communications channels. Incident response firms were engaged, law enforcement was notified, and plans were drafted not to stop the breach, but to manage its consequences.
We're all human. Mistakes were made. It's fine. But what we need to do then is just be responsive, be transparent, and as much as you can, just be upfront with your customers about what's happened. And you're going to have to apologize because the person on the other end of the line is contacting you most of the time as a customer, and they've been affected in some material way, typically. That is then going to lead to lots of discussions between yourself, the customer, leadership, on how everyone is going to have to direct or redirect their efforts so that we can avoid, similar issues in the future. And I think that's exactly what, for example, Equifax did, right? They did their best to pivot. They went out and they got security champions across the organization. So they really made a hard pivot and change in order to address, some failings that existed for quite some time.
Notably absent was any immediate signal to the outside world. For more than a month after discovery, consumers were not told. During that time, their identities remained exposed, their risk unchanged, and their trust intact only because they had not yet been given reason to doubt it.
When investigators start suspecting a foreign adversary, even before attribution is completely 100% confirmed, How does that shift the mindset for a security team?
Understand that they are well-resourced and likely, right, they're going to be better than you are. And the question is then, how can you recover? That's the biggest piece that I see. And hopefully you have some immutable backup somewhere that are well protected and not also compromised so that you can recover in those moments.
The breach had ended. The crime had already occurred. What remained was the reckoning. And when it came, it would not be contained within firewalls or boardrooms. It would spill outward into Congress, into courtrooms, into the lives of millions of people who would never know precisely when their personal histories crossed a border they could not see. The attackers vanished as quietly and quickly as they had arrived, and the system kept on running.
Something that your Zero Lab research really brings to the surface is how much identity sprawl around things like service accounts, old credentials, stale permission. Those things build up over time. In a situation like Equifax, why does that type of identity sprawl amplify the impact so dramatically?
Mark, I think identity sprawl is one of the most underestimated risks in large organization because it accumulates over time. And in our conversation today, we've been really unpacking a lot of that, right? It's not just about people anymore. And you sort of said threat actors are pretty nefarious. Part of it is also because they don't have organizational inertia the way we do. They don't have legacy technology the way we do. So they're able to be laser focused and precise in what they want. And I think there's also a conversation around what we as security professionals deem to be crown jewels and what they deem to be high value targets. One of the things we're seeing, with our Zero Labs data, is that AI agents, service accounts, API tokens outnumber human users by a ratio of 82-1. And that was, in modern enterprises. And that was in our recent survey, I'm going to say in October. And I'm already seeing numbers from the team that it's like 100-1 right now. And so that change happened quickly, and organizations are just not keeping up. I mean, we all have AI initiatives. Everyone's got use cases, projects, low-hanging fruit. Everyone's trying to figure this out. But that is something that we're seeing. And this is, highly sort of, I would say, shifting the identity landscape. And service accounts that rarely rotate, permissions that made sense years ago but have never been updated. Lifecycle management that's been neglected completely or ad hoc for many of these non-human identities.
If you're enjoying the CISO Signal, please drop a comment and let us know what you think of the show. And if there's a true cybercrime you'd like us to investigate or a CISO you'd like to see featured on the podcast, please share it in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Now, back to the episode. Act 3, the cost of exposure.
The public learned the truth on September 7th, 2017. By then, the breach was already history, at least in technical terms. The servers had been examined, the vulnerable portal had been taken offline, and incident response firms had finished reconstructing what could be reconstructed. The attackers were long gone. All that was left to do was to say it out loud.
Cloud sprawl, I would say, would actually be another contributor to this problem. And our Zero Labs research actually found, I'm going to say about 90% of IT and security leaders that we surveyed are managing hybrid cloud environments. So with each provider having their own native solution for identity and access management, this really overloads and taxes the teams and leads to a lot of cloud misconfigurations that are frequently exploited.
Equifax disclosed that attackers had accessed sensitive personal information belonging to approximately 147 million people, mostly Americans, but some residents of the United Kingdom and Canada as well. The numbers were so large they defied intuition. Nearly half the US population, a statistical event masquerading as a corporate incident. For consumers, the news arrived without context or comfort.
This is an area that threat actors know very well off and really does complicate recovery, right? And individually, none of this in an isolated environment, not catastrophic, but collectively, it does create an environment where threat actors don't need to break doors down. I mean, they're able to walk through these doors that are already open. Like we said, they log in, and between cloud sprawl and identity sprawl, it really amplifies the impact pretty significantly. It turns sort of this one single foothold into the door into this massive lateral movement and kind of escalates and persists within the environment. So yeah, over time, it quietly does remove the boundaries that teams assume are still there. And I mean, if Equifax shows us anything, This is what happens when sprawl meets scale, and we haven't even touched AI.
I'd agree with that. Identity sprawl really is the attacker's best friend. So yeah, this is definitely an issue across the industry for sure.
A hastily launched website offered a way to check whether one had been affected. It faltered under the load. Phone lines jammed, instructions were unclear, and at one point, Equifax directed victims to a separate domain, raising immediate concerns among security professionals that the response itself looked like phishing. Trust behaves like glass. The first crack is quiet, but what follows is a deafening shattering. Inside Washington, the tone was much sharper. Congressional hearings followed quickly, executives were summoned, and questions focused on patching failures, asset visibility, and expired certificates. Mundane details that now carried national weight.
After Equifax, the CEO, the CIO, and the CISO were gone almost instantly. You've worked closely with leaders in those high-pressure moments. What do the really good ones do differently when everything else is on the line?
Leaders who handle these moments best don't wait for that perfect information. They're communicating, they're transparent. And the best leaders anchor their teams around facts, not the optics. Leaders who show up and answer questions. I think we have to empower our leaders, CEOs, and their directs.
Yeah, and I think that highlighting of risk is so is so critical all the way up the chain, right? So highlight the risk to the business, that everybody understands what it is. And then you can, here's our top 3 risks. These are potentially business ending. And then just be sure that everybody's anchored in facts.
Equifax's CEO, Richard Smith, acknowledged failures and apologized publicly. He resigned later that month. The company's chief security officer and chief information officer also departed. But the departures, critics argued, looked more like rotation than accountability. And resignation was not the final word. In March 2018, federal prosecutors announced something different. The Security and Exchange Commission charged Jun Ying, the former chief information officer of Equifax's U.S. Information Solutions Division, with insider trading. According to the complaint, Ying had reviewed internal information about the breach and, before the public disclosure, sold shares worth nearly $1 million. He pleaded guilty and was later sent to federal prison.
From your experience, how does internal misconduct, incidents like this, change how you respond?
I try to be really careful with my team members, my business partners, and those sorts of things. So it's just, look, a mistake has happened. Let's not compound that mistake by doing other things that would really make it worse. Please just stick to the facts. And please do not alter the environment in any way. It's okay what happened, right? All we're going to do is we're going to investigate, we're going to contain it, and we're going to do our best to recover. And if we just stick to that and stick as a team and you get out of this blame culture, then I think everything will be okay.
And another employee, software development manager Sudhakar Reddy Bantu, also pleaded guilty to insider trading related to the breach and received home confinement. At the same time, scrutiny widened. Several senior executives, including CFO John Gamble and other vice presidents, had also sold stock in August of 2017, shortly after the breach was internally discovered, but before it was disclosed publicly. In total, roughly $1.8 million in shares changed hands. Investigations followed. Internal and independent reviews concluded these executives did not know about the breach at the time of their trades. They were not charged. But for millions of consumers, learning that their identities had been exposed, the idea that anyone inside the company might have moved first before the public knew cut deeper than technical failure.
So when I talk to boards after an incident, during an incident, the same questions come up over and over, usually around impact, exposure, and what they're not seeing. I'm guessing you hear a lot of these patterns too. After a breach, like on Equifax, what's the question boards ask you and rubric most often?
They don't ask how the breach happened, right? They want to understand what the blast radius of that is, and is this going to be persistent, and what is the risk to the organization? Is this going to recur? And it's really not about the blame game. This is about containment and business viability. And I think the number one question is, how resilient is the organization? And cyber resilience or AI resilience equates to enterprise resilience. Like, are we fiscally going to be able to stay afloat and run the business, right? Is this going to impact the franchise, trust, reputation? So that's the first question. What, as an industry, we haven't really benchmarked, resilience readiness, right? What is sort of the rubric? And there's a lot of work around this, but what is that rubric? How are we baselining what good looks like? And like, what is the art of the possible for us to get there? That's really the question that comes up. Cyber resilience readiness, like, what are the gaps? How good are we? How healthy is this company? And are we, and what do we need to be doing to get better?
The victims, meanwhile, were left with a new kind of burden. Unlike a stolen credit card, an exposed identity cannot be canceled. Social security numbers don't rotate. Birthdays, they don't expire. The harm was not immediate or guaranteed, but probabilistic and permanent. A low-level risk that would follow people for the rest of their lives.
Kavitha, Equifax went through a major transformation after the breach. From your perspective as Chief Transformation Officer, what signals tell you a customer is genuinely ready to commit to transformation?
This is the complexity of transformation. Let me give you an example to answer that question. I recently was working with a CISO for an organization that had an incident, brought the CISO in, said, okay, we've got to build a lot of security hygiene. We've got to completely revamp, take a look at what our security posture is, et cetera. Obviously, infrastructure, IT own a lot of the services and infrastructure budget. So you have a CISO who has 100% responsibility, but zero empowerment to make the right decisions around, a majority of the technology stack. The signals that tell us whether an organization is ready to commit to transformation is when we start seeing the breaking down of silos from a cultural perspective between IT and security, because this sort of culture and organizational sort of inertia really holds organizations back.
Credit freezes surged across the country. Identity monitoring became routine, and a generation learned belatedly how fragile their digital selves really are.
Why do you think organizations struggle so deeply with systems that seem too important to touch, even when they're too old to trust, perhaps?
These critical systems become really invisible over time. They just become part of the cog and they continue to spin and go. But what's happened in the background is that as a part of a complete implementation, folks either didn't have time, didn't have the resources, didn't have the competency in order to put in a full cycle or full life cycle management for that particular service. And in which case they age, and now you're left, quote unquote, vulnerable.
In 2019, Equifax reached a settlement with the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and state attorneys general. The headline figure reached up to $700 million, including restitution, fines, and mandated security improvements. Equifax would never admit wrongdoing, but the money changed hands, even though the data would never be recovered.
For CISOs and CXOs listening, what's the one big identity lesson they should carry forward from Equifax, you think?
I think it's the modern attack surface. I think everything pivots through access, and you can't protect your data if you don't understand who can touch it, when and why. I think if we can't explain our identity posture, then we cannot explain our risk posture. Mark's talked a lot about risk, assessing risk. I think the one other thing, you asked me for one, I'll give you two, beware of concentration risk. The very vendor that's selling you your applications is the very vendor that's securing your application.
Then, in February of 2020, a new chapter opened, one that complicated the story rather than closing it. The U.S. Department of Justice indicted 4 members of China's People's Liberation Army, alleging that they were responsible for the Equifax intrusion. According to the indictment, the breach was not financially motivated, but part of a state-sponsored intelligence operation designed to assemble dossiers on American citizens. China denied the allegations. None of these defendants were arrested, of course. No trial followed. The data's ultimate use remains unknown. Was it used for espionage, counterintelligence perhaps, future leverage? According to public reporting and expert analysis, it's impossible to say. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
If a new CISO pulled you aside and said, how do I prepare for the next Equifax? What would you tell them to do first?
The classic line is assume breach. And one of the areas that I tell folks to take a look at, and hopefully they have mechanisms like this in place, they're not universal, but take a look at some very common signals. Number one, right, and so you can prepare, right, is to understand just how susceptible your folks are to things like phishing. How good is the posture of the organization already? And then you can understand just how much you are assuming breach.
Kavitha, thank you so much for being on the show. Really appreciate you having you and hope you come back again soon.
Jeremy, thank you so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
And Mark, thanks for coming back again. That's your second time on the show. Looking forward to having you back for a third time.
Yeah, I loved it. Loved meeting you, Kavitha. Looking forward to more of these in the future.
And so the Equifax breach ends without the blood-red rare satisfaction of a dramatic stakeout and takedown. No recovered database, no moment where the criminals are caught and cuffed and harm undone. Just a system that failed quietly, recovered publicly, and then moved on while the consequences were quickly covered like a corpse in a shallow grave. Today, Equifax still operates, credit scores are still calculated, decisions are still made in milliseconds based on data that once slipped out the back of the system without anyone noticing. The breach is no longer active, but the risk? The risk is, in a world of cybercrime, this is often how the story ends, not with a clean resolution, but with exposure. A reminder that in digital systems built on trust, the most dangerous failures do not announce themselves. They simply persist. And so, we must remain forever vigilant and always listening for the CISO signal.
If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't, thanks for listening this long. We'll see you on the next episode of the CISO Signal. All episodes are based on publicly available reports, postmortems, and expert analysis. While we've done our best to ensure accuracy, some cybersecurity incidents evolve over time and not all details have been confirmed. Our goal is to inform and entertain, not to assign blame. Where facts are unclear, we've used cautionary language, and we always welcome your corrections. Thanks for listening to the CISO Signal.